was standing out in front, and he was greeting people as they were leaving and talking to them. And when he saw this one man coming toward him, he reached out and shook his hand, and he kind of pulled him aside, and he said, "Friend," he goes, "you need to join the army of the Lord." And he said, "Well, Pastor, I'm already in the army of the Lord." And he said, "Well, then how come I only see you at Christmas and Easter?" He said, "I'm in the Secret Service." I'm in the Secret Service. Well, I want to back up today and kind of lay out Paul's timeline for visiting Jerusalem both times, because we have this man named Barnabas that we're going to talk about. He plays a very important role. Galatians 1 and 2 actually have parallel passages in the book of Acts. So chapter 1 in Galatians corresponds to Acts 9 in Acts, and then in his second trip that we're going to be talking about today actually correlates to Acts chapter 15. And Luke, who all evidence points to Luke writing the book of Acts, he gives us some more details as to what went down, these different parts of the story. And if I was Paul, I would have included some of these details just because I think they're really cool. But as we talked about, he's a pretty humble guy. By this time, Galatians is his first letter that he's writing. And so he leaves some of this out, but that's why the Holy Spirit inspired Luke to write these details. So just as a recap, Paul has his conversion experience on his road to Damascus. He's going there to persecute Christians, to try to bring them back to Jerusalem. And Jesus knocks him off his high horse, and he's struck blind. And so they lead him into Damascus, where he sits for 3 days in the dark and waits for a man named Ananias to come in and heal him. And his conversion at that point is pretty much complete. And then he leaves and he goes into the desert, into Arabia, for 3 years. And a lot of Bible scholars think that he was in Arabia for a full 3 years, which would make sense if we're looking at 3 days and 3 years, that number 3 that we talked about, and how that means completeness. He may have been there for 3 years, we don't really know. He may have come back early. What we do know is that when he finally came back to Damascus, he got to work. He got to work preaching, he got to work teaching and disputing and talking with some of the Jews there to explain to them how Jesus was the Messiah. And this is the very thing that 3 years earlier he was trying to stamp out. Now he's the one doing that. And so needless to say, he was making some enemies. He was making people pretty upset, preaching what he was, which he had to have expected because he was doing the same thing. And what they tell us in the book of Acts is that there was a plot that had been formed by the Jews there to kill Paul. They had gotten mad that we got to take this guy out. We don't like what he's saying, and so they had put people at the entrances and to the gates in and around the city to catch him and try to kill him. But some of the Secret Service discovered the plot. The church there discovered the plot. And so they decided they need to get him out of the city. And so what they do is they actually put him in a basket and they lower him out a hole in the wall. So there's a wall that goes around the city. They actually sneak him out in the middle of the night. And then, as we said, he could have gone anywhere at that point. But he chooses to go to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples there. And so he goes up to Jerusalem, and who does he find? Peter and James, right? Peter and James. Everybody else is freaked out. They don't know if this is legit. So he gets in to talk with Peter and James, and that would have took some doing. I mean, you don't just go to Jerusalem and knock on Peter's door to his house and say, "Here I am." He actually had somebody that paved the way for him, and that's where Barnabas comes into the story. I like Barnabas. He opens the door for Paul to come in. Sometimes it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. And he kind of greases the wheels and says, "Listen, this is legit. Paul's the real deal. I was with him in Damascus, and I heard him preaching the gospel." Barnabas' name actually means son of encouragement. You know I'm into names. I like the meanings. He's son of comfort, son of encouragement. And the cool thing about this is that was actually his nickname. So even more impressive that his name's Barnabas, but they actually called him this because he was such an encourager. His actual name was Joseph, and he was a Levite, which is important to note because Barnabas is a door opener. And when I think about the function of the Levites, right, these people were set apart to do the work of the Lord. Remember Moses? He comes down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, and the people are having Mardi Gras down at the base of the mountain. And so Moses smashes the 10 Commandments, and he has a quick conversation with Aaron, his brother, who built the golden calf that they're all worshiping. And then he says, whoever's with the Lord, come stand with me. And the Levites are like, they go over and stand with Moses. And then, you know what happens? 3,000 people die that day when the law came down. And so the functions of the Levites, they were the priests. And so as the priests, they were the go-between between the people and God. They were offering the sacrifices. They were making a way, or opening the door, if you will, for the people to be made right with God under the old covenant. They were also the singers. They were the ones that led the people in worship. And so when we worship, sometimes we'll say that we are ushered into the presence of God through worship. So they're bringing them in. And then there were also the teachers. So you had them as priests, you had them as worshipers, you had them as teachers. And teachers open people's minds, right? They make sure that the things that they know are true. And so Barnabas is going in, he's opening the door, he's letting them, he's clarifying that Paul is legit and what they have been hearing is true. So he brings Paul in, he's there for 15 days, and then he leaves. And we're told that he goes through the regions of Syria and also through Cilicia. And Paul is from a city called Tarsus. He was called Saul of Tarsus. And Tarsus is actually in the region of Cilicia. So after Paul leaves Jerusalem, he goes home. So he wasn't planted long in Damascus, but after he leaves Jerusalem, he goes back home and back to his roots, right? That's where he plants himself. You know where the most difficult place to minister is? It's in your home. That's the toughest place to minister. To lead spiritually around the people that see your weaknesses, that see your faults, that see you every single day. And if you want to know how your Christian walk's going, just ask your family. Because they'll give it to you straight. They'll let you know. Paul gets to work both spiritually and physically. Most of the Pharisees had jobs. They had other jobs. They were part of this religious ruling class, but a lot of them had jobs. And Paul was, and now he is again, a tent maker. And, this is a lot of churches or a lot of denominations have different views on pastors, whether they are full-time pastors or whether they're working bivocational, because of this part here, because he is out teaching and preaching, but he's also making tents. But he's also leading the people there. He is teaching in the synagogues, and it tells us later on in the book of Acts, and then also in his letters to the Thessalonians and then to the Philippians, that, hey, I'm working, I'm paying my way. I don't want to be a burden to you guys. So I'm working both spiritually and I'm working practically. So that gets us caught up through chapter 1 to where we are today. So let's look at our portion of Scripture today. We're going to read Galatians chapter 2. We're going to do the first 10 verses, 1 through 10. Paul accepted by the apostles. I call this Apostles Assemble. If you know the Marvel movies and the Avengers Assemble. It's not really funny if you don't get it. So that was the reason for it. Devin thought it was funny, my wife, but I didn't know if everybody would get that. Okay, Paul is accepted by the apostles. Then after 14 years, so 3 years after his conversion, he goes up to Jerusalem. 14 years after his conversion, so 3 plus 11, he goes up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. And I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately, because those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek, yet because of the false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. To them we don't yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted to the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James, And Cephas, who's Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me. They gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to be to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing we were eager to do. 14 years after his conversion, he heads back up to Jerusalem. And when before that, he's down in Tarsus, and they're hearing these rumors trickle down again of these Judaizers who are going in and telling people, look, not all Jews are Christians, but everybody who is a Christian needs to become Jewish. You need to be circumcised, you need to keep the laws. And so the consequences of this message were pretty serious, because if they were allowed to persist, if they kept going, this could cause a church split. This could have made Christianity just another sect of Judaism. And Acts 15 tells us that Barnabas and Paul had no small dissension and debate with them. So these guys came down, and Paul and Barnabas are letting them have it. And then it says that by revelation, God told Paul, you need to go up and speak with the other apostles. And so Barnabas opens the door again, brings them in, and this time they weren't freaked out. They actually embraced Paul and Barnabas. Now it says that he wanted to make sure that he wasn't running or hadn't run in vain. Now, we talked about this before, but he wasn't worried about the message. He got the message straight from Jesus. So he wasn't worried about running in vain there. What he was worried about was his fruitfulness. We talked about being fruitful last week. If they were allowed space within this, religion that was, recently started around Jesus, this Christianity, if they were allowed to come in, then that message was going to confuse a lot of these new converts, especially the Gentiles. And if that was allowed to persist, then we're talking about a church split. Paul was invested heavily in the Gentiles, and he didn't want to see that become unfruitful. So that's what he was concerned about. And he takes with him Titus. Now, Paul, when he writes in the New Testament, he pretty much has two proteges. One is Timothy, who was half Jewish and half Greek, and then Titus, who is a Greek protege. And he took him as a test case, really, because he's concerned about what's going on in Jerusalem, and he wanted to know whether or not the apostles were being influenced by these legalists, or whether or not they were holding to the gospel of grace. And so he takes Titus. He wanted to see how they react when he brings him along. And as Titus, you're putting a lot of faith in Paul here when you're going in front of a bunch of people that are saying you need to be circumcised. He might have been a little bit nervous. But he was relieved to find out that they weren't going to make him be circumcised. So he was a test case, but he also was a testimony. He was a testimony to Paul's fruitfulness, to the inclusion of the Gentiles. Galatians, we know, is Paul's first letter. And he writes in the New Testament a number of letters, obviously, wrote most of the New Testament. He writes 3 what we call pastoral letters. He writes 2 to Timothy, and then he writes 1 to Titus. And in the message to Titus, he calls him a legitimate son in the faith. He is a legitimate son in the faith. And he actually appointed him to go to these different cities where churches have been planted and appoint elders. And he told him, listen, I want you to go in. I want you to speak up for sound doctrine. I want you to do it with all authority. And so he invests heavily in Titus, and he goes on to become an effective leader in the church. William Barclay, who was a Scottish theologian and author, said this about discipleship. This was the important part of Paul's ministry as he was discipling for the next generation. He says, it is possible to be a follower of Jesus without being a disciple, to be a camp follower without being a soldier of the king, to be a hanger-on in some great work without pulling one's weight. Once someone was talking to a great scholar about a young man, and he said, so-and-so tells me that he was one of your students. And the teacher answered devastatingly, he may have attended my lectures, but he was not one of my students. It is one of the supreme handicaps of the church that in it there are so many distant followers of Jesus and so few real disciples. What Paul was concerned about is his discipleship. He didn't want that to be stifled at all. But there were these false brothers that were coming in. They had snuck in secretly to spy out their freedom and to try to drag them back into slavery. But Paul says that they didn't yield to them for a second. They didn't give them so much as an inch. Because again, they needed to be disqualified. They needed to be on the outside. That needed to be made very clear for there not be any confusion. Jesus told us that he was doing a new thing. He was doing something completely different. And in Matthew chapter 9, the disciples of John the Baptist come to Jesus, and they're like, look, we're sweating it out in the desert with John, and we're fasting and we're eating bugs, but your disciples don't fast at all. Like, what's the deal? And Jesus says to them, I'm doing a new thing. And he tells them in verse 16, he says, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and both are so preserved. You have to wonder sometimes, as Jesus says, giving these examples, if they scratch their head a bit. Because when I would read this the first time, I was scratching my head a bit. Like, what's he talking about with pieces of cloth and wineskins? I think we all get the patch analogy. The wineskins were actually made out of animal skins, and then would pour the wine in there because it would stretch. And so as the fermentation process happened, the skins would expand. And when it was complete, they would get hard. And so you couldn't repeat that process because there was no more room to expand. And what Jesus was saying is the old religious structure, the old covenant of Judaism, it wasn't going to contain what Jesus was going to do. It was too much of a stretch. We could put it that way. He was doing a new thing. Then Paul tells us that those who seemed to be influential made no difference to him. God shows no partiality. It was important that they added nothing to his message. There was unity in the message and no partiality. Just look at the lineage of Jesus. And that's a pretty clear picture that God doesn't show any partiality. Right. Matthew, when he writes down the genealogy of Jesus, he mentions 4 women. And that's significant because in that day when you did a genealogy, you only listed the men. So it's significant that he lists 4 women. Not just 4 women, though. The 4 that he mentions are pretty shocking. He mentions Rahab, who was a Canaanite prostitute in the city of Jericho that helped out the spies before it got leveled. And she ends up in the lineage of Jesus, which is pretty shocking. Then you have Ruth, who was a Moabite. The Israelites weren't supposed to intermarry. Their family did. She got married to Boaz, and they have a child and becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. Tamar and Bathsheba are chiefly known for their involvement in public sex scandals, right? Tamar with Judah, and then also Bathsheba with David that we know. So that's the reason they're famous. And so he writes down these 4 women to let us know there's no kind of, with God, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So, you guys can read about that at your leisure. We won't go much into that. But Matthew could have given us any number of women to write down, but he makes a good point that God shows no partiality. He uses whom he will. People even saw Jesus as an illegitimate son, right? They weren't believing that he was born miraculously. And that would have been a really hard thing to live with in that culture. He tells us they didn't add anything to him. There wasn't anything that he was teaching that was out of step. They encouraged him, yes, but there wasn't any new revelation. The Bible is 66 books, right, written by about 40 authors over a span of 2,000 years in 3 different languages without any contradictions. That's pretty amazing. So the fact that their message matched up perfectly after 14 years is amazing, but not surprising. So when the message is confirmed, the unity of the body is kept intact, and these false teachers are left on the outside. In the Second World War, there were a group of soldiers that were fighting in the countryside out in France. And during one of the battles, one of the American soldiers is killed. And his friends didn't want to leave him on the battlefield, so they take him off and they want to give him a church burial. They had seen a church a couple miles behind the front lines, and they had a little cemetery there with a fence around it. And so they wanted to take him there. And after they got permission to take his body, they went there, carried him the whole way. And so they start knocking on the door of this church. And an old priest comes to the door and answers, and they say, our friend was killed in battle, and we would like to give him a Christian burial. And the old priest didn't speak very good English, but he could tell what they were asking. And he said, was he Catholic? And they said, no, I think he was Methodist, actually. And so the priest says, I'm sorry, like only those of the same faith can be buried in our cemetery. And so they hang their heads and they turn around, and as they're leaving, the priest says, but you can bury him outside the fence, just outside the cemetery, you can bury him there. So that's pretty close. So they shrug their shoulders and they get to work, and they finish sometime in the middle of the night, and they go back to their camp. And the next day they get the orders that they're going to move out. They're going to leave that place. And so they want to run back and say one last goodbye to their friend. And when they get there, they can't find the burial site. They can't find it. So they go up to the door and they knock on it, and they talk to the priest, and they're like, hey, it was the middle of the night when we were doing this last night. We must have got disoriented. Do you know where the gravesite is? And a smile came across the priest's face. And he said, last night after you left, I couldn't sleep. So I went out early this morning and I moved the fence. And I love that story because Jesus moved the fence, right? We are brought in as the Gentiles. We're now in. So I love that story. No partiality, good to remember. Okay, verse 7, go back and just as a recap. Verse 7 says, on the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. This was huge. They were recognizing the uniqueness of each other's ministries. They were both different. They each had their own flavors. Paul to the Gentiles and Peter to the Jews. There are 4 main characters here. There's Peter, Paul, James, and John. Right? So these are the 4 people that are talking here. Each one in their letters has a very unique expression, a unique flavor to what they wrote. Remember we talked about the unity of the gospel message. And so they're unified in their message, but the things that they had emphasis on was a little bit different. Peter, for example, Peter must have been a firstborn. He was a natural-born leader. He was an organizer. He liked to do things in an orderly way. He was kind of the apostle of order. In his writings, he talks about a spiritual priesthood. He talks about offering spiritual sacrifices, that we are a spiritual house. And he calls Jesus the guardian of our soul. So these are all examples or pictures that the people would have been able to understand, the Jewish people would have been understand. This ritualistic kind of, structure that they had set up, these certain way of doing things, that now this was supposed to be a spiritual thing that we were doing, not just physical. And then we have Paul. Paul was pretty blunt. He was really the apostle of frankness. He was pretty candid. He just would say things and just let the cards fall where they may, like it or not. And he wasn't afraid to get in people's faces, as we're going to find out next week. He just told it like it was. There wasn't much formality with Paul. And so the evangelical church, churches like ours, maybe relate a little bit more to Paul. We're not very formal. And hopefully we're just going to speak the truth in love and just let that stuff, let the Holy Spirit do its work. John was an apostle of passion. We call him the disciple of love. As he got older, his message got even simpler. Church history tells us that as he was older, they would literally take him from church to church, and people would crowd in to hear what the apostle, John was going to say. And so they were waiting with bated breath, and he would sit there and he would just say, little children, love one another. His message was love. People will know that we're his disciples by our love one for another. He was the one that called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was the one that was leaning on his chest during the Last Supper. But it wasn't always that way. He and his brother James, Jesus dubbed them the sons of thunder. So he wasn't always the disciple of love. They were going through a Samaritan city that didn't welcome them. They were pretty rude. They didn't want them around. And so John and James say, Jesus, do you want us to call down fire to burn them up? Just like Elijah did? And that didn't happen. But churches that are more Pentecostal, maybe more visionary in flavor, that's their emphasis, might relate better to John. And James, we know what James was about. James was the disciple of action. So listen, I'll show you my faith by my works. We're going to do some practical things. That pure and undefiled religion is this, that we care for widows and orphans, and that we keep ourselves unstained from the world. He thought, listen, we should just put all of our denominational differences aside and link arms and do some practical work. So churches that stress more community outreach or missions or things that are practical, caring for the poor, the homeless, they might relate a little bit more to James. Christians were the ones that actually started some of the first organized hospitals. In 325 AD, the Catholic Church actually instituted hospitals to be built in every city where there was a cathedral. They said, if there's a cathedral, we need to build a church there. I mean, it started at the very beginning of Christianity. That was a huge part of Jesus' ministry, was healing the sick. And so everywhere that Christianity went, care for the poor and the sick went with it. I mean, just look at a small sample here in Kansas City. You've got St. Luke's, you've got St. Joseph's. Where we live, we're in Indiana, you have Lutheran Hospital is the big hospital. So a lot of these started with the church. So we can recognize different church bodies and their different emphasis, their different flavors, and extend the right hand of fellowship to them, that they have a specific ministry or a mission that they're about, and we have ours. But Paul warns us in 1 Corinthians 1, he does give us a warning, because we have a tendency to rally behind an idea or behind a mission. And he says this in verse 13. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I was baptized by none of you except for Crispus and Gaius. Crispus and Gaius. Funny names. Yeah. He baptized Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. Parentheses, I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I don't know if I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. So everybody was hey, I study under Paul. I study under Apollos. I study under this guy. We follow this person. And so they were identifying themselves around teachers instead of around Jesus. And so he issues a warning that, listen, you might have an emphasis, and your church is one way of doing things, but it's not the way. Jesus is the way, but he may give each of us different missions. Yes. Verse 10 says, only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. James was the apostle of action. He was the apostle of doing practical things. But here it says that they all asked him to remember the poor. All of them. God instituted care for the poor early on into their culture, into the Jewish system. He started it back in the book of Leviticus. And I'm sure you guys all read Leviticus this week in your devotions. Let's see if I can find Leviticus. There we go. 19, verses 9 and 10. This actually passage is called Love Your Neighbor as Yourself. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So he put into place a practice of taking care of the poor. It's interesting because the Jewish word for righteousness is actually tzedekah. And the root word of tzedekah is tzedek, which means justice or charity. And so a lot of these Jewish families would have a box in their house that they called their tzedekah box. It was their righteousness. They got to practice their righteousness by giving to the poor. So they would put money in the box. When it filled up, they would take it out and give it to a person or an organization in need. In Matthew 6, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about this powerful thing, giving to the needy, that was such a part of their culture. But it had become such a big deal that some had taken it as a way to make a big deal of themselves. And I'm including this because in our social media culture, we put a lot of things out there when we do practical works. And I just think we need to check our motivation for why we do these things. Are we doing them to practice righteousness to the Lord, to give to the Lord, or are we doing it for our own righteousness? Because in Matthew 6, he says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be seen and praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward." So I get concerned at times when things get posted or things get said or presented in a way that the intentions may not be pure, right? Now, that's not for me to decide. I'm just encouraging everyone that when we do this, to check the intentions of your heart. Because what he says here is that if you're doing it just because you want to look good, then that's your reward. Like, that's your pat on the back. You're not going to get any rewards in heaven if you do it that way. Yes, we need to do it. But what would happen is these religious people would stand up and they would, make a big show of them giving money at the temple or giving money to the poor. They would stand there and they would say it really loudly so that everybody would know that they were giving. Remember Mary of Bethany? We talked about this in our first service. She came in and she anointed Jesus with this expensive perfume. And Judas freaks out because he says this could have been sold, all this money, and it could have been given to the poor. And Jesus, even though Jesus knows that he's doing it, from a selfish point of view, he's not saying it because he cared for the poor. He was saying it because he was a thief. Jesus says, listen, you're going to always have the poor with you, but you're not always going to have me. So you're going to have endless opportunities to practice righteousness, but you're not always going to have me. Are you going to, walk the walk? Are you going to practice what you preach? Now, if you think about it, they say, remember the poor. Where were most of the poor churches? They were in Jerusalem. They were in Judea. That's where the church started. So most of the poor churches were there. They were saying to Paul, listen, you guys, Paul and Barnabas, you're going out into the world, into prosperous, into progressive cities. When you get there, don't forget about us. Send money. And you see this throughout his letters. He's telling people, listen, we need to raise money for the church in Jerusalem. You were grafted in spiritually. The least you can do is provide for them practically. And then he would say, listen, I'm coming. You better be prepared. I don't want you to be embarrassed when I get there. So take up the offering, and then we'll take it to Jerusalem. There was a woman who called a service because one of her blinds on her window was broken. And so she called a blind repairman. And he shows up at the house one morning, and he knocks on the door. And so the husband gets up, and he goes to answer it. And this guy's standing there, and he says, hey, I'm here for the Venetian blind. And so the guy says, oh, okay. And so he walks back into the kitchen, and he fishes out some money from the grocery envelope, and he walks back, and he hands the guy $5, and he says, thanks, and he closes the door behind him. And as he goes back into the kitchen, his wife says, what was that about? And he says, oh, somebody's collecting for the blinds. Blind. He had the right mindset. He was thinking the right way. He wanted to give. So we'll give him credit for that. So what kind of church will our church be? What kind of church will Bethany Fellowship be? We're just starting out. But our church, we can't do everything, but the things that we will do, we want to be good at and dedicated to the mission that God has given us. Obviously, we'll be a Jesus church. But we will be a church that supports missions. There are, or there should be, two types of Christians, those that go and those that send. Right? And for those that don't go, we will be the ones that send. And we will support that here in our church. We will be a Bible-based church. We'll be biblically sound. If people come here and they don't know the scriptures, it won't be because they don't hear it on Sundays. Right? So we will be about the scriptures in a big way. And then we'll also be about worship. We want to be big into worship. And that looks like a lot of different things. But we will be about worship. Whether that is worshiping up here corporately or worshiping out in the community, whether that means, giving and doing it that way so that we can take up collections for people that need it. Those will all be acts of worship. So I'll have you guys come back up. The next time we meet, it will be the new year. And it's not unusual at this time of the year for people to be excited to leave the old year behind and step into a new year. And I think it really just speaks of our desire to be renewed. And people will be making New Year's resolutions. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Not an encouragement, but 80% of those will fail. So you can make those, get an accountability partner to help you out, help you stay on track. But in 2021, as we kind of gently step into a new year, not knowing what that holds, I pray that we would be those that can extend the right hand of fellowship to people that are our brothers and sisters, but maybe have a different emphasis, a different flavor, that we don't let denominations or anything trip us up, that we would be people that are worshipers, and that also people that would reach out in compassion to people that are less fortunate than us. So those are the things that we want to be about, because that's what leads to new life, to abundant life, right?